Ram Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram Ram Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram Ram Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna Krishna Hari Ram Ram Hari 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 Ram 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 Hari 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 Ram Ram Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna Krishna Hari Ram Ram Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram Ram Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram Ram Hari Hari Jai Vishaka Priya Hari Bol Radha Darshini Nav Kishori Sanvya Subhadra Mai Kishore Krishna Kripa Siddhi Ksenia Madhumati Rasa Priya Haribol. Okay, Harasha. Ksenia E Krishna Priya. Haribol, Haribol, Hare Krishna. Okay, Haribol. Сейчас лекция будет. Now will be class. Right. No, that's fine. Okay. Devotees. Reading from Srila Prabhupada-lilamrita. Let's see, where are we? Biographies. Prabhupada-lilamrita. And what is it now? Let's just see where we got up to. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swamin Iti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschachadeshatarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivas Adi Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vanshkalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyeva cha Patidanam pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Yes, okay, so we're still in, I think it's chapter 5 about the war, 2 wars, the war within the Gaudiya Math and the Second World War. So continuing on. In 1945, the war over and India still in turmoil under British rule, Abai saw a good opportunity to make his business more successful. In Lucknow, 600 miles from Calcutta, he rented a building and opened his own factory, Abai Charan Day and Sons. It was a major investment, requiring 40,000 rupees to start, and he began on a larger scale than ever before. Also, according to law, to ensure that he was not dealing in the black market or misusing chemicals, he had to employ 3 government inspectors. Yet despite a high overhead, he established a good market and his products were in demand. He closed a small operation in Calcutta and concentrated on the Lucknow business. Although the building was known locally to be haunted by ghosts, Abai had not been deterred. But when he began his operations, some of the workers came to him frightened. "Babu, Babu, there's a ghost." Abai then went through the entire building chanting Hare Krishna, and after that there were no more complaints of ghosts. On November 13th, Abai wrote to his servant Gauranga, mentioning some of his difficulties in Lucknow and asking him to come there to help. In this letter, Abai spoke bitterly of his wife, Radharani, and children. This is the letter. Gauranga Prabhu, please accept my obeisances. I received your letter dated 7th. Due to lack of time, I could not reply in time. I stay here alone with some servants. If I leave now, then I have to close everything down. Due to my leaving once and closing the business, I've lost about 10,000 rupees, and the goodwill has also been affected, and my enemies have increased. That is why I'm fighting, practically staking my whole life. I'm staying here all alone in the middle of so many difficulties, not for nothing. That's why I was writing to you repeatedly to come here. As soon as you receive this letter, show it to Dobra. Take at least 10 rupees from him and come here. When you come here, I will make arrangements to send money to your home. What's the point in holding you back with an excuse that there's no servant or maidservant? I tried to serve them enough by keeping servants, maidservants, and cooks, but up until today, they've not become attached to devotional service. So I'm no more interested about those affairs. When you come here, then I will go to Calcutta. If I see that they're interested about devotional service, then only will I maintain my establishment there. Otherwise, I will not maintain them anymore. Bring a quilt for me. Yours, Abai. Oh, that's intense, isn't it? This is 1945. And Prabhupada eventually moved out. I think it was 56, so it's still another 10 years to go, or something like that. But yeah, Prabhupada is really not happy. The two interests, family and preaching, were conflicting. Radharani had never shown any interest in back to Godhead. She seemed to work against his enthusiasm, both for publishing and for earning. The business was called Abhay Charan Day and Sons, and yet the sons were disinclined to help. And when he had called for a servant to join him in Lucknow, the family had objected, saying they needed Gauranga more there. What was the use? The family was interested neither in backing him in his business, nor in taking up the life of devotional service. And since his business was primarily an outcome of his family life, he resented that he had to give it so much of his energy. It was the old economic law by Marshall that he had learned in college. Without family affection, a man's economic impetus is weakened. Of course, there could be a compatible balance between family service and devotional service. Bhaktivinoda Thakur had described two simultaneous obligations, bodily and spiritual. Social status, mental development, cleanliness, nourishment, and the struggle for existence were all bodily obligations. The activities of devotional service to Krishna were spiritual, and the two should parallel one another. In Bhaktivinoda Thakur's life, his family was a source of spiritual encouragement, and he used his social position to advance his preaching. But Abhai's experience had been different. The two paths seemed to be at war, each threatening the other's existence. He felt himself operating somewhat like the materialists he'd criticized in his writings, absorbed in the struggle for existence with insufficient time for self-realization. Although his family made more and more demands of him, he was feeling less inclined to work for them and more inclined to preach Krishna consciousness. It was a predicament. He could only push on diligently, support his family, expand his business, and hope for a great success so that he could revive his publishing. But the Lucknow factory seemed almost beyond his means. He had purposely begun on a large scale with the aim of making a larger profit, but monthly expenses were high. He had fallen behind in his rent, and now he was involved in a court case with the landlord. Although he was visiting Calcutta regularly and shipping raw materials from Calcutta to Lucknow daily, he always found his family members in Calcutta uncooperative. His servant, Gauranga, was also reluctant to work as Abhay required and was thinking of going back to live with his family. Abhay again wrote to Gauranga on the 23rd. This is the letter. Offering my humble obeisances at the feet of the Vaishnav. Gauranga Prabhu, I have received your postcard dated 18th of November 1945 and got all the informations. There's no need to come here just for a month after spending the money and then go back. For the present, take 25 rupees from Dabra and go home. Write a letter to me after your arrival, then I will send the rest of your money in 1 or 2 installments by money order. Then from there you let me know when can you come here. I've started my work here in a fairly big scale. You've seen that with your own eyes. So if there's no income, who will spend for a court interrogation? Everything is on my head. The brother and sons are just eating and sleeping like a bunch of females and breaking the axe on my head. Hare Krishna. Shoo, that is heavy. That's just heavy. You go home as soon as you get the money and try to come back as soon as possible. Yours, Sri Abhay Charan Day. Now, chapter 6, An Unknown Friend. with a little introduction from Madhavendra Puri. Let the sharp moralists accuse me of being illusioned. I do not mind. Experts in Vedic activities may slander me as being misled. Friends and relatives may call me frustrated. My brothers may call me a fool. The wealthy Mammonites may point me out as mad, and the learned philosophers may assert that I'm much too proud. Still my mind does not budge an inch from the determination to serve the lotus feet of Govinda, though I am unable to do it. Unquote. It's Madhavendra Puri. Aside from his difficulties with business and family, Abai had to survive the cataclysms of Indian independence and partition. He was not active politically, but was one of hundreds of millions affected by the violent dawn of Indian independence. While Gandhi and the Hindu-dominated Congress were demanding a united free India, the Muslim League, led by M.A. Jinnah, called for partition and their own Muslim nation, Pakistan. The conflict raged. In August 1946, the outgoing British government invited Jawaharlal Nehru, Congress Party president, to form an interim national government, but the League objected. The Muslim cause would be denied. Jinnah had already declared August 16th Direct Action Day, which amounted to little in most parts of India, but in Calcutta erupted in Hindu-Muslim rioting. In 5 days of violence, 4,000 died, and thousands more were wounded. In the months that followed, Hindu-Muslim rioting repeatedly flared up throughout India. Early in 1947, when the new Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, met with Indian political leaders to plan transfer of power, riots again broke out as Muslims demanded Pakistan. At the threat of civil war, Congress finally agreed on partition, and on July 18th, the Indian Independence Bill passed without dissent. 1 month later, India and Pakistan emerged as independent nations, with Jawaharlal Nehru as India's first Prime Minister. Partition tore India, leaving 5 million Sikhs and Hindus in Pakistan and as many Muslims in India, and the Great Migration began. Refugees fleeing from Pakistan to India and from India to Pakistan clashed with each other and even with their own countrymen of the opposing faith, and the violence that erupted claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Srila Prabhupada. Our independence movement was started by Mahatma Gandhi ji for uniting all the different sections of the people. But actually the result was that instead of being united, India was partitioned. And the partition became so poisonous that formerly there was only sporadic Hindu-Muslim riots in some places, but now there was organized fighting between Pakistan and Hindustan. So actually we were not being united, we were being separated. The Hindus would go to the mosque of the Muslim and break it, and the Muslim would go to the temples of the Hindus and break the idol. And they will think, we have finished the Hindus' God. Just like the Hindus also think, oh, we have broken their God. They're all ignorant. God cannot be Hindu. God cannot be Muslim. God cannot be Christian. God is God. We have seen in 1947 Hindu-Muslim fighting. One party was Hindu, the other party was Muslim. They fought, and so many died. And after death, there was no distinction who was Hindu or who was Muslim. The municipal men gathered them together in piles to throw them somewhere. They fought, and in Bug Bazaar there were heaps of dead bodies. And when it is a dead body, nobody could understand who was Hindu and who was Muslim. Simply it was to be cleared from the road. Unquote. Bug Bazaar, of course, that's where the headquarters of the Gaudiya Math had been. Of course, the Gaudiya Math is all broken up by now, but previously it was the headquarters in Calcutta, Bug Bazaar. Abai was not expecting Indian independence to bring any real solutions. Unless the leaders were God-conscious, what change would there be? Now he saw that instead of suffering at the hand of a foreign rule, the people were free to suffer under their own countrymen. In fact, the fighting and suffering had increased. This is one thing that Prabhupada remarked on. In regard to the destruction of the culture, the spiritual culture, Srila Prabhupada made the point that what the Muslims could not do in terms of destroying the Vedic culture in India, what the Muslims could not do in some hundreds of years, I'm not sure how many, that they were ruling India, and what the British could not do in however long they were ruling India. So what the British couldn't do in terms of destroying Vedic culture, the Indian people themselves managed to do after independence in just, 30 years, something like that. Throughout the years of India's political struggles, Abai had never lost his desire to propagate Krishna consciousness. He had seen how promises of unity and independence had brought mostly higher prices and civic mismanagement. He had seen neighborhoods where Indians had lived peacefully for generations erupt in hatred and rioting in the wake of British and Indian diplomatic manipulations. It was, as Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had described it, quote, persons who are strongly entrapped by the consciousness of enjoying material life, and who have therefore accepted as their leader or guru a similar blind man attached to external sense objects, cannot understand that the goal of life is to return home back to Godhead and engage in the service of Lord Vishnu. As blind men guided by another blind man miss the right path and fall into a ditch, materially attached men led by another materially attached man are bound by the ropes of fruit of labor, which are made of very strong cords, and they continue again and again in materialistic life, suffering the threefold miseries. Unquote. That was Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. The Vaishnav prays to his spiritual master, who has opened my eyes with the torchlight of transcendental knowledge, and he feels obliged to help humanity by bearing the same torch. As a representative of the eternal Vaishnav Parampara, Abai wanted to shed the light of transcendental knowledge onto the field of current crises. That had been the purpose of Back to Godhead, although since 1944 he had been unable to print the magazine. But even without the means to publish, Abai continued writing. His most ambitious project was Gita Panishad, his translation and commentary of Bhagavad Gita. Gandhi and others often spoke of the wisdom of Bhagavad Gita. Indians never forgot their Gita, but most proponents did not teach it as Krishna had taught it. They would not recognize Lord Krishna, the speaker of their Gita, as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but would extract his words as slogans to bolster their own philosophies. Whether political leaders, religious leaders, or scholars, they almost invariably made their own symbolic and allegorical interpretations. Abai wanted to present Bhagavad Gita as is. It was to be 1,200 pages, 3 illustrated, beautifully bound volumes. For Abai, the books were already a reality from which he was separated only by time. Over the past 2 years, he had accumulated hundreds of manuscript pages. He wrote in notebooks and on loose papers, and then typed the numbered manuscript pages. He could never give the book his full time, but gradually it began to take shape. He also preached Lord Chaitanya's message through letters, writing to many leaders in the government, to respectable acquaintances, and to people whose articles he had read or whose activities had caught his eye in the newspaper. Presenting himself as a humble servant, he wrote to them of his ideas on how India's original Krishna-conscious culture could be applied as the successful solution to all manners of dilemmas. Sometimes his letters drew replies, and Abai would respond, fanning the sparks of interest wherever he found them. A well-known reformer, Mahendra Pratap Raj, was forming what he called the World Federation. Abai had read a news sheet which Mr. Pratap had published from Vrindavan, in which he addressed all nations and peoples of the world and called for a unity of mankind. Abai wrote to him suggesting that Lord Krishna's teachings in Bhagavad Gita provided a theistic science capable of uniting all religions. Mr. Pratap replied in May 1947, "I admire your deep study of Srimad Bhagavad Gita. I myself am a great admirer of the great classic. I assure you that I'm working strictly according to the book." Mr. Pratap mentioned his book, Religion of Love, and suggested that Abai read it if he wanted to know the World Federation's view of religion. In the meanwhile, Mr. Pratap wrote, "I do not agree to your suggestion of making the name of Krishna or Govinda as the basis of the unity of religions. This would amount to conversion and won't lead to unity of religions. I highly appreciate your efforts in the direction of back to Godhead." Abai got the book, read it, and in July 1947, while he was visiting Kanpur, wrote a reply. He had traveled to Kanpur not as a spiritual teacher, but as a pharmaceutical salesman. Yet a typewriter had been available, and out had come his preaching. Quote. So he's replying to Mr. Pratap. "In continuation of my last postcard, I beg to inform you that I've finished the reading of your book, Religion of Love. In my opinion, the whole thesis is based on the philosophy of pantheism and the approaches made by the services of mankind. Religion of love is the true religious idea, but if the approach is made through the service of mankind only, then the process is made imperfect, partial, and unscientific. The true religion of love is perfectly inculcated in the Bhagavad Gita. Perhaps you have not quoted any authority for all your statements, so it is more or less dogmatic. If different men put different dogmatic views about religion and its essentials, who is to be accepted and who is not to be? Therefore the approach shall be and must be authoritative, scientific, and universal." Unquote. Abai then gave a summary of the Bhagavad Gita in 10 points, concluding, "The highest service that can be rendered to mankind is, therefore, to preach the philosophy and religion of Bhagavad Gita for all time, all places, and all people." But extended philosophical dialogue was not usually the result of his letters. In 1947, when Abai wrote to high government officers of the newly formed government of India, suggesting a remedy for riots, they turned him away. When he asked to talk with the governor of West Bengal, the governor's secretary replied, "His Excellency regrets that he's unable to grant you an interview at present, owing to heavy pressure of work." When he wrote to the assistant secretary to the Minister of Education, an assistant to the assistant secretary replied, "The government of India regret that they're unable to accede to your request." Sometimes official interest took the form of a patronizing pat on the head. For example, "I'm sure your scheme for establishing peace will meet with response from our Prime Minister." And another, "He, the Minister of Education, is glad to see you're taking to root out communalism. He suggests that you get in touch with," unquote. A local official asked not to be seen. I thank you for all that you've written and the fine sentiments which you have expressed. It is no use arguing the matter, as I do not think that I can serve any useful purpose by joining the organization which you wish to set up, and therefore you need not take the trouble of seeing me. I wish you, however, all success. In October, after the Calcutta riots of 1947, Abai wrote to the chairman of the Rehabilitation Committee, who replied, quote, "Regarding Hari Kirtan and Prasadam, you may make any program of your own, but I'm afraid I'm not interested in the same, nor my committee, and therefore there's no necessity of your meeting with me." Unquote. Abai was fulfilling his role as a Vaishnav preacher, and the secretaries of the various government offices were recognizing and addressing him as such, but they could not appreciate his applications of the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita and his suggestions for Hari Kirtan. Occasionally, however, someone seemed interested. Mr. N.P. Astana, High Court advocate, replied, quote, "I'm very much obliged to you for your letter re your broad scheme about spiritual improvement. I thoroughly appreciate the fine feelings which have prompted you to write this letter and the kindness with which you have considered my query. I've been a student of Bhagavad Gita and have also imbibed some of its teachings, but I still lack a good deal, and will be glad to be guided by a person of your accomplishment. You may kindly, therefore, send your scheme to me, on receipt of which I'll be able to express my views." It was inevitable that Abai would think of engaging Mahatma Gandhi in devotional service. Because of his lifetime of courageous, ascetic, and moral activities on behalf of his countrymen, Mahatma Gandhi had great power to influence the Indian masses. As with Mahendra Pratap of the World Federation, Mahatma Gandhi's idea of serving God was to try to bring happiness to man through politics and through his own invented methods. As one Englishman had said of Mahatma Gandhi, he's either a saint amongst the politicians or a politician amongst the saints. But be that as it may, he was not as yet fully engaged in pure devotional service, and his activities were not those of a Mahatma as described in Bhagavad Gita. The Gita defines a Mahatma as one who fully engages in worshipping Lord Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, always chanting his glories. The Mahatma encourages others to surrender to Krishna. But because as a young man Abai had been a follower of Gandhi's, Abai had a special feeling for him. Of course, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had later convinced him to engage exclusively in devotional service, but now Abai felt his old friendship for Gandhi, even though Gandhi was a towering figure of worldwide fame, and Abai unknown both to Gandhi and to the world. On December the 7th, 1947, Abai wrote to Gandhi from Kanpur. Gandhi was living at the Birla Mansion in Delhi, where large military forces throughout the city discouraged Hindu-Muslim rioting. Gandhi's secretary, Payarilal Naya, described Gandhi at this time as the saddest man one could picture. The men he had led in the struggle for Indian independence, Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel and others, had taken the leadership of the nation. And Gandhi, with his doctrines of non-violence, unity, and agrarianism, was now at odds with them in many ways. He feared he was becoming an anachronism, which means something just too much out of date. His former colleagues admired him, but rejected his leadership. All his programs, Hindu-Muslim unity, non-violence, upliftment for the poor, although praised throughout the world, were failures in the India of 1947. On a recent visit to a Muslim refugee camp, a group of Muslims who surrounded his car had cursed him. And at a public prayer meeting, a Hindu crowd had shouted him down and ended his meeting when he had attempted to read from the Quran. What speculation! Just such speculation. Just foolishness. Really, just lacking real understanding of Vedic literature. At 78 years, Gandhi was physically weak and melancholy. In all likelihood, Abai's letter would never reach him. Abai knew it. Sending a letter to Gandhi would be like putting a note in a bottle and sending it to sea. It would arrive in the flood of mail, and Gandhi would be too busy to see it. But Abai sent it nonetheless. So here's this letter to Mahatma Gandhi. Dear friend Mahatma Ji, please accept my respectful namaskar. I am your unknown friend, but I had to write to you at times and again, although you never cared to reply them. I sent you my papers back to Godhead, but your secretaries told me that you have very little time to read the letters and much less for reading the magazines. I asked for an interview with you, but your busy secretaries never cared to reply this. Anyway, as I am your very old friend, although unknown to you, I'm writing to you in order to bring you to the rightful position deserved by you. As a sincere friend, I must not deviate from my duty towards a friend like your good self. I tell you as a sincere friend that you must immediately retire from active politics if you do not desire to die an inglorious death. You have 125 years to live as you have desired to live, but if you die an inglorious death, it is no worth. The honor and prestige that you have obtained during the course of your present lifetime were not possible to be attained by anyone else within the living memory. But you must know that all these honors and prestiges were false, inasmuch as they were created by the illusory energy of Godhead, called the Maya. By this falsity, I do not mean to say that your so many friends were false to you, nor you were false to them. By this falsity, I mean illusion, or in other words, the false friendship and honors obtained thereby were but creation of Maya, and therefore they're always temporary or false, as you may call it. But none of you, neither your friends nor yourself, know this truth." Unquote. The letter's going to continue in a minute. A sadhu is not supposed to flatter but to cut. This is the basis of his friendship, that he cuts away the illusion of the materialistic person. Mahatma Gandhi, forsaken by his friends, bitterly disappointed at the outcome of the long, hard struggle for Indian independence, and apprehensive about the future, had been reduced to a position in which he might be able to realize that his friends and work were ultimately illusory. Thus it was the perfect time for him to comprehend Abai's message. Quote, "Now, by the grace of God, that illusion is going to be cleared, and thus your faithful friends like Acharya Kripalini and others are accusing you for your inability at the present moment to give them any practical program of work, as you happened to give them during your glorious days of non-cooperation movement. So you're also in a plight to find out a proper solution for the present political tangle created by your opponents. You should therefore take a note of warning from your insignificant friend like me, that unless you retire timely from politics and engage yourself 100% in the preaching work of Bhagavad Gita, which is the real function of the Mahatmas, you shall have to meet with such inglorious deaths as Mussolini, Hitler, or Lloyd George met with." Unquote. It's so prophetic. It's just amazing. Prabhupada had such insight, because that's exactly what happened. He just died in a pathetic way, just pathetic. For years, Abai had wanted to approach Mahatma Gandhi with this message. In fact, he had written before, although it had been of no avail. But now he was convinced that unless Gandhi got out of politics, he would soon die, quote unquote, an inglorious death. That Gandhi was remaining active in politics rather than preaching devotional service put him in need of a warning. Abai was writing to save a friend. Quote, "You can easily understand as to how some of your political enemies in the garb of friends, both Indian and English, have deliberately cheated you and have broken your heart by doing the same mischief for which you have struggled so hard for so many years. You wanted chiefly Hindu-Muslim unity in India, and they have tactfully managed to undo your work by creation of the Pakistan and India separately. You wanted freedom for India, but they have given permanent dependence of India. You wanted to do something for the upliftment of the position of the Bungis, but they're still rotting as Bungis, even though you're living in the Bungi colony. They're all therefore illusions, and when these things will be presented to you as they are, you must consider them as God sent. God has favored you by dissipating the illusion you were hovering in, and by the same illusion you were nursing those ideas as truth, unquote. And there's more to come. Abai dutifully attempted to inform Gandhi that there was nothing absolute within this relative world. Ahimsa or non-violence must always be followed by violence, just as light is followed by darkness. Nothing is absolute truth in the dual world. You did not know this, wrote Abai, neither you ever cared to know this from the right sources, and therefore all your attempts to create unity were followed by disunity, and ahimsa was followed by himsa. Abai pointed out that Gandhi had never undergone the standard practice for spiritual advancement, namely accepting a bona fide spiritual master. Although Bhagavad Gita declares the necessity of accepting a guru in disciplic succession, Gandhi was well known for listening to his inner voice and for extracting ideas from various writers like Ruskin and Thoreau and mixing them with teachings from the New Testament and the Gita. Had Gandhi approached a guru, said Abai, he would not have become bewildered within the sphere of relative truth. Quote, in the Katha Upanishad it is ordered that one must approach the bona fide guru, who is not only well versed in all the scriptures of the world, but is also the realized soul in Brahman, the Absolute, in order to learn the science of the Absolute Truth. So also it is instructed in the Bhagavad Gita as follows, Tadvadi pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya, upadeksyati te jnanam jnaninas tattvadarshana. But I know that you never underwent such transcendental teaching except some severe penances which you invented for your purpose, as you have invented so many things in the course of experimenting with the relative truths. You might have easily avoided them if you had approached the Guru, as above mentioned. You know, if Gandhi had actually listened to Prabhupada, maybe he'd be one of our God brothers. He'd be a member of ISKCON, and he wouldn't have died in the way he did. So that was, unquote. Recognizing Mahatma Gandhi's godly qualities and austerities, Abai requested him to employ his moral elevation for surrendering to the absolute truth. Abai urged him to get out of politics immediately. Quote, but your sincere efforts to attain some godly qualities by austerities, etc., surely have trained you to some higher platform, which you can better utilize for the purpose of the absolute truth. If you, however, remain satisfied with such temporary position only, and do not try to know the absolute truth, then surely you're to fall down from the artificially exalted position under the laws of nature. But if you want really to approach the absolute truth, and want to do some real good to the people in general all over the world, which shall include your ideas of unity, peace, and non-violence, then you must give up the rotten politics immediately and rise up for the preaching work of the philosophy and religion of Bhagavad Gita without offering unnecessary and dogmatic interpretation on them. I had occasionally discussed this subject in my paper, Back to Godhead, and a leaf from the same is enclosed herewith for your reference. I would only request you to retire from politics, at least for a month only, and let us have discussion on the Bhagavad Gita. I'm sure thereby that you shall get a new light from the result of such discussions, not only for your benefit, but for the benefit of the world at large, as I know that you are sincere, honest, and a moralist. Awaiting your early reply with interest, yours sincerely, Abhay Charan Day. There was no reply. A month later, Gandhi announced that he would fast until death unless India made a payment of 550 million rupees to Pakistan, a previous condition of the partition agreement. At first, Hindu refugees from Pakistan demonstrated outside Gandhi's darkened room, chanting, "Let Gandhi die." But as he fasted, each day closer to death, he aroused the heartfelt concern of the nation, and the government leaders repaid the money to Pakistan. Then great crowds approached him chanting, "Let Gandhi live." Meanwhile, Hindu-Muslim violence continued. On January the 30th, the day after he had drafted a new constitution for the Congress Party, Gandhi took his evening meal, worked at his spinning wheel, then walked towards his evening prayer meeting, and was shot 3 times in the chest. He died, crying out the name of God, "Hey Ram." Abhai's letter of the previous month suddenly read like a prophecy, but it had not been read by the person for whom it was intended. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.